We are talking about a subject that I think is top of mind for everyone, making government cool again.
This is a administration that wants to lean forward and isn't afraid of upsetting some of the ecosystem that's out there.
Technology continues to advance rapidly, and, just to be blunt, the government is nowhere near prepared for it. We just don't have the right talent here.
While it's very hard for the government to compete with Silicon Valley on compensation, we do rule on mission. You get access to some of the world's hardest problems in the government. You get agency to affect potentially over 300 million people.
The U.S. will win the future if we blank.
Win the AI race.
Remain undistracted.
Scott, Greg, it is so wonderful to have you both here. Today we are talking about a subject that I think is top of mind for everyone, making government cool again. We're pleased today to have Scott Kupor, who's the director of the Office of Personnel Management, and Greg Barbaccia, who's the Chief Information Officer for the United States. Both of you have very different backgrounds coming to Washington than what we've previously seen. But we are seeing this, I would call it a renaissance of people in the private sector, and particularly people in tech with tech backgrounds, wanting to serve their country, wanting to come into government. So I think I'd start with you, Scott. You were employee number one, managing partner at Andreessen Horowitz, had long been in the private sector, helping to build companies, investing in companies. What made you say, I'm done with managing a 600-person organization, and now I'm going to manage 2.3 million people in the federal government?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us. It's really, and it's great to see you again, obviously, as a former partner. I definitely was not running away from A6Z, just to be totally clear. In case Mark and Ben are listening, in case Mark and Ben are listening, no, I love A6Z. Look, it was very simple, which is I just thought it was a confluence of events that made sense, which is we know we're on this kind of precipice from a fiscal perspective, right? We're clearly spending way more money than we should. And we've got this problem, which I know Greg is, well-versed on, which is technology continues to advance rapidly. And, just to be blunt, the government is nowhere near prepared for it. And some of that is obviously a procurement issue, and others that I know Greg and team are working on it. A lot of it's a talent issue. We just don't have the right talent here. So it was a combination of those things, an administration that I felt like actually this was a real priority for them. And, we've had incredible support from the president around everything from what, David Sachs is doing on the AI side to obviously a lot of the merit hiring proposals that we're doing. So I don't know, it just was almost like serendipitous, which is right time for me personally, right time, luckily for Mark and Ben to be able to say, hey, if this is what you want to do, go do it. And then an opportunity to really just kind of do some things that I thought were really important for the country.
Totally. And I think a lot of our tech listeners probably have never heard the term OPM before. No. So maybe just give us an overview. What does OPM do? And then when you were thinking about, as you said, talent is so important. Yeah. But it's something that I think a lot of normal Americans don't think about, like the talent in the federal government. What does that even mean? So maybe talk about your thesis and philosophy of how you can help reshape that.
Absolutely. So it's not surprising people don't know what OPM is. As I've said publicly before, I didn't know what OPM was either until the transition team started talking to me about these opportunities. Yeah. So it stands for Office of Personnel Management, as you mentioned. I think the very simple way to think about it is we are the kind of talent organization for the federal government. So our job is everything to hopefully bring the right talent in, to make sure we have policies around, what are the hiring standards for government? What are we going to do on performance management? The goal in my mind is very simple, which is how do we attract and retain the very best people in the country and, make sure that we can deploy their efforts on behalf of the American people. So that's at a very high level kind of how to think about it. Just to kind of level set again for the organization, we've got we started the year about 2.4 million civilian employees. So we don't have responsibility for uniformed military, but there's about 2.4 million civilian employees. We've done a lot of work over the course of this year, a lot of which was catalyzed by Elon and the Doge team. As a result, we expect probably that we'll end up with somewhere around 2.1 million employees at the end of the year. So roughly about a 300,000 reduction. Those are a lot of those came from kind of the voluntary programs that DOGE had put together, these deferred resignation programs and other stuff. So despite the fact that obviously anytime you're talking about people losing jobs, it's obviously a real serious issue. The good news is I think we were able to design programs that gave people the option, if they just didn't want to be part of the Go Forward organization, to be able to kind of, self-select and, volunteer to kind of go do other things.
Absolutely. And we'll certainly get more into kind of organizational design and how you remake something that big. Greg, I want to come to you because you have a very different background of having worked at Palantir, a veteran, done a host of different things, but really always focused on technology. What was it that made you say, okay, now I'm going to bring this private sector technology expertise into government?
Yeah, like Scott mentioned, right administration, right timing. It's certainly in the zeitgeist lately that this is a time for change. This is a administration that wants to lean forward and isn't afraid of upsetting some of the ecosystem that's out there. So I saw this as a real opportunity, especially where I'm at in my career, to make some different change. So I jumped at the opportunity.
And then when you hear the word chief information officer, I think a lot of people probably think very different things about what that could mean. What are your tasks, your roles, and what does a CIO do inside the federal government?
Yeah, so it is not directly analogous to what you would see in the private sector. I am responsible for technology policy and budgeting decisions across the entire executive federal branch. So one of the big priorities of the administration is one government effort. So how do we move forward as one government? A lot of the issues we've had in the past where individual agencies do things in silos. So how do I galvanize the CIO community to move the administration priorities together as one?
Yeah. Yeah. One question I always ask people when they come from government into Andreessen Horowitz is, what has surprised you most? Because I always see this sort of culture shock on people's faces and having left the government after 20 years and coming to work for us, it's a very different culture. So I want to ask you all the same question. Maybe let's start with you, Greg. What was the thing, you've been in seat how many days now?
230 something.
So
who's counting?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Who's
but
counting?
it is by days, right? Every day counts. So what has surprised you most in those first 100 days? What was the thing you wrote down and said, I just can't believe that this is how it works, or this was not what I was expecting?
The compliance and regulatory regime is incredibly complex. Coming from Silicon Valley, where we move fast and break things, you do not have that opportunity in the United States government at this level. So that was a surprise to satisfy some cliches. Often things do take an act of Congress, and oftentimes we do need to make a federal case out of something. So that was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah. And Scott, you've been in seat 100 and...
Yeah, about 110 days or so right now. So
So
still shorter than
so,
Greg. Yeah,
so
we're
first
getting
100
there.
days, what's been the thing that shocked you the most?
I want to give a little nuance, at least what I've observed that Greg was talking about, and maybe this is the same thing, which is there's no question, right? There is a different, kind of compliance and regulatory environment for sure. And look, a lot of those are good reason. But what was most interesting to me from a culture and people perspective is just this over obsession with risk. Right. And so I sat in a couple of meetings in my first, couple of days. I was like, why do we do that this way? Right. And the answer was, well, if we don't do it this way, we might get sued and then something might happen. And I asked people, I was like, okay, how many times have we actually been sued? Right. Like how many times that actually happened? And the honest answer is like blank stares. Nobody actually knows and nobody actually tracks it. But we've kind of just embedded in the culture this idea that risk is like this pass fail thing. Like you either have risk or you don't have risk. And if you have risk, God forbid, like you should ever go there, basically. And so that to me was like the most eye-opening thing. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by it, but it was just almost like a cult of obsession, basically, that anything that involved some element of risk, that was like the primary thing we were trying to do was mitigate risk. There was no concept of either how big or how small is that risk, and then certainly no concept of the world that, you live in and I used to live in, which is kind of how unbounded is the upside relative to that risk. Like that conversation just never happens. And that was just super eye-opening for me.
Have you reflected on why that is? I mean, there's always been the joke that Washington is a town of lawyers, right?
Yeah.
So everything is a legal issue. It's not a business issue. It's not you can't look at it from any other lens. You're a lawyer.
Yeah.
What is your sort of takeaway as to how we've gotten to the point where we never look at upside and we only look at, let's just make sure that we don't fail?
I think there's a couple issues. So one is, I think that's right. Look, there's a ton of lawyers that run around here and that make a living basically scaring people into worrying about risk. And look, as a former lawyer myself, it's the Full Employment Act for lawyers here in D.C. There's no question. And some of my best friends are lawyers, so I don't mean that in any, derogatory way. I think the other thing is part of it is the political system. So if we just forget about like the executive branch, people like us, if you go to the other side, right, down this way towards the hill, the problem is anytime somebody makes a mistake, the opposite party basically wants to use that mistake as an example for why their entire position is wrong, right? So the one I love to talk about, as you know, in our conference room in Menlo Park, we have a Solyndra, an old Solyndra, I don't even know what it is, a panel or something that Mark kind of somehow picked up at one point in time. And if you remember the whole debacle over Solyndra, right, this was in the Obama administration. They did this big loan. It turns out Solyndra goes bankrupt. And everyone was like, look, Obama's an idiot. This is terrible, right? The government should never be doing this stuff. Now, probably the government shouldn't have been doing that. But the point is, nobody ever said, okay, like, what are the other 50 projects maybe that we've done if we think clean energy is important? What are the other 50 things we've done? And yes, like some are going to fail and some are going to succeed. Okay. And then hopefully some succeed wildly. But there's no concept, I would say, of a portfolio.
Yes.
Everything is a one-off project. And when a one-off project fails, then whichever party didn't sponsor it says, those guys are idiots. This is why you should never vote for them. This is why you should never trust them. So I think that's a bigger part of it. you asked me like what's been different. The other thing is like the number of oversight agencies and the amount of activity this government spends. I mean, Greg, I'm sure you deal with it too, but every day I have a report from the GAO, or I have a report from the OIG, or I have a report from, God knows who, or some Democrat on my committee who, doesn't like what we're doing. And they're all well-intentioned, right? They're all intended to be oversight, but then you've created this culture of oversight, which therefore then means like we should never take any risk because nobody wants to like see their department show up in a GAO report, basically. So we've just overdone this concept of risk as a way to actually, kind of direct behavior.
Totally. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. Where do you see sort of the misunderstanding or miscalibration of risk going wrong in terms of working with technology or bringing technology into the federal government?
Like Scott mentioned, for me specifically, I have more auditors auditing my team than I have team members. And that's not hyperbole.
Yeah.
In the private sector, lawyers are focused on how do we enable the business in a way that's responsible, and how do we give our leadership a sober analysis of risk. In the government, it is very hard to lose your job and very hard to get fired. And one of the only ways that happens is when you get sued. And also, like Scott mentioned, when you get dragged up to the hill and all these victory laps the party that's not in power at the moment takes. So that, just encircles everything we do.
Yeah, and but I would just add, and again, Katherine, you know this from the world that you live in today. Like, I'm not sitting here, and I don't think Greg is, like, none of us is saying we should go do the Silicon Valley risk here, right? No one's saying, like, let's just throw caution to the wind, let's do stuff. Like, we do need to make sure people get their Social Security checks, and people, actually we have a national defense system that works. But we're so far on the other side that, like, just some modicum of saying, I've been using the term internally in my team, measured risk is what I've been telling people, like, that's an objective for the organization. And what I'm just trying to get them slowly to say is, look, like, there's no such thing as 100% on any test. Everything has some risk. Let's just understand it. And yes, if it's catastrophic, and if we get it wrong, and that means like the national security of the government is in play, then we probably shouldn't do that, okay? But like the vast majority of things we do don't involve sovereignty or national security, or does somebody actually get a Social Security check?
Yeah, no, that is a good point, that not everything is a crisis, and this is a town that specializes in crisis.
We love a crisis, yes, exactly.
But you actually, you said something very interesting. I believe it was on either ABC or NBC, but you said that only 4% of federal employees are ranked below expectations. 60% are ranked at meeting expectations. And, going back to this culture of we can't fire anyone, or we can't actually talk about anyone's performance. Maybe talk a little bit about how coming into an organization where everyone is a superstar and no one is bad at their job, how do you kind of shuffle through, okay, these are the high performers and these are low performers, given that everyone is ranked on a grading curve, as you've said. Yeah.
So let me give you some new numbers, because it's actually even worse than what you said.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
The good news is it's worse. So the narrative still plays, right? Which is okay. So just to take one step back, everybody in the government gets ranked. Well, not everybody. Most people get ranked 1 through 5 in their annual review. 5 is the best score. 1 is the worst, and 3 means you're meeting expectations, right? You're doing what you're supposed to do. So 4s and 5s, so the very, very top, is roughly 65 to 70% of people get a 4 or 5. 90, when you add 3s, 4s, and 5, that's 99.7%. Okay, so 99.7% are a 3 or higher. 0.3%, therefore, is a 1 or a 2. Now, look, in a 2.3 or 2.4 or 2.1 million workforce, you might expect, like, it's probably the case that not everyone is above median, and you would expect that there's enough of a population that you would have some normalized type of distribution, right?
Yeah.
That's just not the case. So one of the things that we're doing, and we just put out guidance on this, at least with respect to what are called the SES, which are the most senior level people in government, is we are effectively doing a modicum of a forced distribution. And so we put out guidance that says only 30% of the people can be ranked a 4 or 5.
Okay.
We didn't put in any guidance as to what the others are, but we're really trying to kind of slowly change the culture to say, you know what, like everybody actually can be measured against one another, and it's not a competition issue. It's, I gave an example in a blog post I wrote. Look, if you are a head of sales in a private company and you do 105% of your quota, you probably are going to do better than the CIO in that company who, achieved 90% of her objectives. Like, and that's reasonable and fair. And you all did a good job. Like, everybody gets a, nice congratulations and a nice, certification. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? And so we've just got this massive grade inflation. And as a result, what's really important is 2 things that follow that. One is the compensation and reward system then is messed up, because if everybody's great, then that means bonuses just get peanut buttered out. There's no differentiation. Promotions just get peanut buttered out. And you've got this opposite problem, which is the people who probably should be ones or twos don't actually ever get ranked that way. And some of that is what Greg said, which is just, it's really hard to fire people. So you can understand the managerial behavior is if it's going to take me 12, 18, 24 months of appeals to do something, I don't want to do it. But as a result, therefore, sometimes people say it's better to keep a warm body in a job than it is actually to go through the process of, removing them, which just makes no sense. And so one of the things we're trying to do is we just want to create a high-performance culture, because the only way that we attract and retain great people is great people want to be surrounded by great people, and they want to work in an environment where their activities are rewarded and where they can be promoted, because of their merit, as opposed to, how many years they sat in a seat. So It's a fundamental cultural change. It's going to take a lot of heavy lifting to get done, but we're starting at the margins, to kind of figure out a way to actually incent the right behavior.
And what's been the reaction? I mean, in some ways, you would expect that there'd be some people who would be kind of shocked by this, but others who say, finally, finally, as a high performer.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. So it's a very, I hear both things. So look, there's no question that if you survey the government and you ask people, there was this thing called FEVS that the government does every year. We didn't do it this year just because we missed the timing for it. It's basically an employee survey, right? One of the questions they ask in FEVS is, does my manager actually manage performance effectively? And in particular, does my manager kind of hold people accountable to behavior? You get extremely low scores on that. So there's no secret. It's not a secret. I think most people, if you ask them, will say, yes, there are people in my organization who everybody knows, and it's true in any organization, right? It's unfortunately true even in a small organization like A16Z. Everybody actually knows who the people are who are really carrying their weight, and also people know who's the small group of people who are kind of just dialing in, basically, right? So it's no secret. So you hear that from people, and that's good. And so there are some people who say this is a good thing. The other concerns I've got on the other end is, well, these are all really high-performing people, and so it's unfair to kind of, not, give everybody a high grade. Also, gee, are we going to create competition among these executives? And my answer to all those has been, on the first question, I was like, look, it's not unfair. This is the world. And the reality is we're not all, kind of equal in terms of our contributions in an organization. So we just need to get over that fallacy and recognize it.
Of course.
And I'm not worried about competition either, because look, if we want teamwork, which I think we do, then you incent people for teamwork, right? As part of your annual review, I know this, right? At Andreessen Horowitz, one of our goals is we believe teams beat individuals. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we review Katherine on every year is are you working in isolation, or are you leveraging the full strengths of the team to win deals or to do other stuff? And so therefore your behavior obviously reflects that if you want to be in the top, performance.
Of course.
It's the same thing in government, right? Mm-hmm. What's the behavior we want? Let's create an incentive structure around it. Let's actually measure people for it. Let's put it in the reviews. And if we do that, I think we get the behavior that we want.
Absolutely. Greg, I want to come to you on this question, because talent is changing so quickly in the private sector, particularly tech, around AI, around all of these new, I would say, kind of paradigm shifts that are happening at once. When you think about recruiting those people or bringing those people into to your world and bringing more, I would say, technologically advanced people into the government, what have been some of the learnings, or how do you think about how talent impacts your org?
I think about what incentivizes people to go to high-performing organizations in general. We give them the tools that they need to be successful. We trust them to have the freedom to innovate. And we need to give them access to problems that are sufficiently difficult and interesting to them. While it's very hard for the government to compete with Silicon Valley on compensation and things like equity, and this is something Scott and I talk about at length, we do rule on mission. You get access to some of the world's hardest problems in the government. You get agency to affect potentially over 300 million people. And you get access to things that outweigh your tenure at the organization, something that if you went to a large company, it would take you perhaps a decade to get to such valuable work on behalf of the company. You could come into government and very quickly do something that every citizen and taxpayer would feel. So that's something we're optimizing on right now.
Yeah.
Greg and I have been spending a lot of time on this, and I would just augment a couple of things. One is, I think there's kind of, look, there's compensation. Look, we're never going to solve the compensation problem with the private sector. But as Greg said, look, I think that's okay. I think there is a class of people who care about public service and who recognize that this has value. I think part of the problem we have on attracting talent is number one, that we don't sell the right narrative, quite frankly. So I'll give you an example. One of my first meetings I had when I started here, somebody on my team who's a career government person said, "Hey, you guys," meaning I think she was. This was the collectively Doge, it was the you guys. She's like, you guys are destroying kind of the message we've always said about government, which is the beauty of government is we attract people because you have, effectively lifetime employment, you have tenure. And, I said two things. I said, one is, look, I hate to break the story to you, but like, that's just a myth. Like, there's no such thing as lifetime employment. Like, nobody has that. And that's just, maybe that was true in the 1950s and 1960s. It's not true. But I said, look, like, that's totally the wrong message. Like, the message we want is exactly what Greg said, which is if you want to come here and solve like really hard problems and do something really cutting edge, and oh, by the way, you want to serve your country, like, that's the mission we want to tell young people on the technology side. And we've never told that story, basically, until we've had people like Greg sitting in the seat. And now we have a good cohort of kind of technology people who can kind of do that. The other, one of the other problems we have, and Greg and I have talked about this too, is the other problem we have with getting, engineers here is many jobs in the engineering organizations are managing contractors, right? And so if you're some like, super smart person, whatever, coming out of, MIT computer science or something, like you actually want to do something cool. You don't want to actually manage some external contractors.
Yes.
And so we've got this endemic problem, which is we're missing talent. Therefore, we go to contractors. Therefore, we can't actually recruit talent because the job is to manage contractors. So like we have to break this mold and actually bring people in. And Greg and I are working on an initiative, which, I'm very excited about, which I'm very confident we're going to pull off to really target on how do we get like particularly early stage technology people into the government and make them effective in actually solving, the most complex problems that we have.
Totally. And that was going to be sort of my next question is, we're sort of obsessed with pools of talent in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
It's like, where's the next pool of talent or where's the next great place to recruit from that other people haven't discovered? Are there sort of untapped pockets or pools of talent where you're saying across America, these people would be fantastic in exactly what you just described? Maybe they don't know we exist, or maybe, maybe they're early in career and they haven't even thought about it, or maybe they're more senior in career and they just haven't thought about making the leap into government. Like, how are you getting the message out and kind of what pools are you attacking first?
Yeah. So at least from my perspective, and Greg may have a different view, is the pool I'm trying to attack first is the early talent pool.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is just, look, as you well know, AI, all this stuff is moving really fast. And so, look, we need people who are really, really conversant with this stuff. And it's not that people who aren't early career can't do this, but, we do know that, look, adoption of technology sometimes takes new people and, who have, very open minds on things. So we want to do that. The other thing is we have a super particular early talent problem broadly in the government. So just to give you a sense, 7% of government employees are under the age of 30. That compares with close to a quarter of the normal workforce outside of government. And by the way, on the other side, we have 45 almost percent of people over the age of 50, which compares to about 33% in the non-federal workforce. So, and again, this is not an ageism comment, but like, look, if we're going to lead on AI, if we're going to lead in new technologies, we need people who are probably at an earlier stage in their career where they're willing to take some of those risks.
Yes.
So that's kind of thing number one I think we need to do is just kind of really go after that. So the program that, Greg and I have been working on, which we're hoping to roll out soon, is to target, okay, how do we get early career people in? Number one. Number two is we have a technical management problem also in the government. So a significant portion of people in technical organizations are not actually technical, and they're managing people who are technical, and therefore they're just not, quite frankly, able to provide career development, other things that happen. So one of the things I think we can lean on the private sector more is to basically help us with that problem, which is let's go to all the great technology companies and say, you know what? Show us your like directors, senior directors, VPs. Let's put them on like a 2-year secondment, for example, in the government and have them come be managers of early career technology teams. And let's start this greater kind of connectivity between the public and the private sector. Mm-hmm. I think this is the other challenge we have with young talent, at least having talked to a bunch of people, is we've created this false dichotomy, which is you're either a career public service person or you're a career private sector person.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a silly dichotomy, right? The reality is, look, most people change jobs all the time, and we should make it fluid, right? And I think there's huge value to the government, and there's huge value to the private sector by us having a lot more commingling of that.
Yeah.
And so, look, I would love to have young engineers come here for 2 or 3 or 4 years and quite frankly then go to the private sector and realize that the private sector values the experience they have, they value the knowledge, and if they want to maximize their earnings, great, go maximize your earnings in the private sector, basically. That's totally fine. But this idea that at 22 years old, you have to decide, like, am I going to go be a 40-year career, civil servant, or am I going to go be a 40-year private sector person? I just think that's an outdated mode of thinking of employment.
Absolutely. Yeah, Greg, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because this concept of a tour of duty, I mean, sometimes you talk to people in Silicon Valley and they say, okay, if I leave my, my fast-moving job right now, or where I'm seeing cutting edge AI, and then I go into government, there's no guarantee I'll be able to go back. There's no guarantee those years will be, the best years of my life where I've learned something. What is your pitch, or how do you kind of implement sort of a tour of duty? Have you thought about sort of how you can bring people in for a couple of years and kind of give status to that, where then they'll be very attractive to the private sector coming out?
Absolutely. I think the new grad, younger talent's a phenomenal idea. I've been thinking a lot lately about people who just had perhaps their first exit or had some success for a few years in the private sector. Come to the government and see how you do, because it is a totally different operating environment. Everything you do after working in tech in the government will be easier, I assure you. And you will learn how to operate in environments of opacity that probably you don't see in the private sector. And I wanted to touch on something Scott mentioned, this technology management problem. This is a very real problem. First, we have it from a screening talent perspective. The people who are screening resumes for technologists in the government perhaps don't have the background to know what exactly we need, what exactly we're looking for. Oftentimes they're the same people screening resumes for a bunch of different roles under their purview. And then this also translates to contracts. So people ask, how do these big contract sprawls happen? How do we get all these tech projects that don't make any sense? If you walk through the White House complex, it looks like a Suburban dealership. There's Suburbans everywhere. But every American has an intrinsic understanding of how much a Chevy Suburban should cost. Yeah. So if I were to hand you a contract for a fleet of Suburbans and they were $900,000 each, you would say, this is objectively insane. That is not how much a vehicle costs. Yeah. But we are missing that crucial talent in the government. This is why the people who are charged with approving contracts oftentimes do not understand the technology problem deeply. They don't understand what is an appropriate solution. They don't understand how long it should take to solve that, how many people we need to solve it, what type of person we need to deploy at the problem if we're speaking about contractors. This is how these large beltway bandits, as they call them, or systems integrators, get these indefinite term contracts that don't make any sense when you're trying to apply the problem. So these middle managers coming from tech is really interesting. We need the people who understand the roles and what they're doing to help adjudicate the talent that's coming in and also the contracts. Otherwise, the sprawl is just going to be an indefinite problem.
Yeah. Greg, if I could have one thing, Greg knows this, but Katherine, just for you and for the listeners, so as Greg mentioned, this all starts even on the very front end of evaluating talent. So we literally have, again, people who are non-functional experts evaluating people's resumes. And their evaluation to date, until very recently, has been, I would call, self-assessment, which is the candidate says, I have the following skills, and the HR person says, great, those are the following skills it turns out are on this job description. Well, it's not by accident that it turns out, these people are smart enough, it's not by accident that it turns out their skills exactly match what's on the job description. But we do not actually verify those. So we do not do a software coding test to hire. You would probably fire one of your CEOs in any of your companies if you found that they were hiring engineers without actually assessing their technical talent for real. Yeah. So, and again, this goes back to what we talked about from a risk perspective. So there's a historical reason for this, which is literally 40 years ago, we used to have a civil service exam. And because of, it was basically taken away very end of the Carter administration, beginning of the Reagan administration, because it was deemed to have disparate impact. So, there was lower scores for minority candidates on it. And so the government entered into a consent decree and said, we will, henceforth no longer do these things. And that literally has sat on the books for 43 years until luckily, actually, one of the first things that, we did in this administration is we were able to kind of exit that consent decree. And then we've given guidance now as part of our merit hiring plan that everybody who's going to apply for a job in the government has to have some functional assessment done, right? So if you're a software engineer, we're going to give you a coding job. If you're applying for an HR job, we're going to figure out what is the right kind of way to actually test your skills. So you've got this just compounding problem, which is you have people hiring people who don't have domain expertise to evaluate them, and there's no check on that, and that just compounds the problem that Greg's talking about, and then those people get promoted, and now you have non-technical people sitting in managerial roles. And so, we have to, just dismantle each brick one by one in order to actually solve the hiring problem.
Totally. And it's interesting because what you're talking about, it's in many ways, it's an opportunity with AI. because I'm going back to a couple years ago, and this was, at Andreessen Horowitz, but also I think across Silicon Valley, there was the earth-shattering moment of ChatGPT's release in late 2022.
Yep.
And I think everyone woke up and said, we have to completely reorient our organizations, completely change our thinking, because AI is the next 10, 15 years at least of how we're going to be thinking about building companies. And that's, it's 3 years later. It's not too late for the federal government to have that moment too. But this, how do you even evaluate these companies? As you said, if you're someone who's never worked with AI or never even really understood the term, how are you going to know which companies to work with? Maybe talk a little bit about sort of the tactical way that you reorient a culture to say, okay, AI is going to be very important for the federal government. We're going to have to learn new things. We're going to have to hire different types of people. We're going to have to work with different companies where maybe we can't pronounce the names as well. like just talk about how you tactically implement that culture for what you're doing.
Certainly, the government loves process and ritual. So we're slowly moving towards, hey, we don't have to do these same mundane, repetitive tasks because we could automate these things. So, this goes back to early days of Silicon Valley, the process versus the product. So in the government, oftentimes you celebrate the fact that you checked all the boxes and you completed a process. Disconnected from the reality of, did this move the needle for whatever outcome we're trying to drive for our mission? So reorienting the culture of the employees in the government to say, your success of your job is now based on the outcomes we're driving for the mission and being focused on that. So we are going to use this technology to kind of change what you were doing all day. Instead of just going through these tasks, we're now going to automate everything that we can do in whatever way is responsible to the mission being driven. And now you're going to do higher value work for the taxpayer. And what's important is we did this in the past. We moved from budgeting from ledgers to Excel, and eventually we moved away from post into email. So instead of doing all these things physically, we did them digitally. Now it's time for another modernization. So to get people comfortable with their roles are intrinsically changing because of this technology in a way we haven't seen in at least a few generations.
Yeah, I think there's kind of, we have to attack it from a couple angles, right? One is, and a huge kudos to Greg, to David Sachs, to Sriram, to all the people and the president for his leadership here, which is we now have at least a tops down directive, right? So the president, through that report, the AI report, basically said, look, this is a critical agenda for the U.S. government. And so for people like Greg who get to talk across like all the CIOs, he at least now can say, hey, look, like the president's been very clear, like this is an important agenda item, and we can have his leadership do that. So I think that's awesome. I think at the micro level, I tell you, like in our organization, we're a tiny organization. We're like, a couple thousand people. You have to just slowly kind of change the behavior. So one of the things we did, like literally, believe it or not, until this week, we did not have ChatGPT on anybody's actual desktop, right? And so I've been, pounding my CIO and pounding my CEO. We finally, literally, thanks to the new deal that GSA did for the, the $1 a year deal, and I'm sure Greg was a part of that too, we now have ChatGPT. Great. So what I've told everybody in my team is like, it is your obligation to learn this. Now, you can pretend that it doesn't exist and you can put your head in the sand and that's fine. But like, I'm not going to be responsible for that because the technology is going to advance whether you use it or not. Mm-hmm. The question for you as an employee in the government is like, do you want to be modern? Do you want to actually like, find ways to implement this? So I've said, look, like just find little things. Like, what are you doing in your job today where you can get a 5% incremental improvement on your efficiency because you like queried something in ChatGPT or we do a ton of rule and regulation writing. Everybody in the government does that. Like, what a great use case for AI, right? Again, like, let's not just, look, we're not going to have the AI write the rules, but AI can do information dissemination. Mm-hmm. It can help you, kind of understand, is this really statutory really required or is it not statutorily required? Mm-hmm. Like, there's little stuff like that where I'm like, there's no risk in that. It's okay. The good news is almost everything in the government is public information anyway, so it's not like we have to put like PII into all these systems. But we just have to like start to change behavior like one person at a time. Mm-hmm. What I worry about is like I think Greg and team will help us with this. But like if we say like we've got this big agenda to get AI, then people are going to build these 5, 10, 15-year plans, and quite frankly, nothing will ever happen. Like we need like micro level projects at each agency with basic use cases to say, how do you just turn the dial this much on efficiency? Mm-hmm. And then I think then you can go do the 5 and 10-year, 15 projects. Totally. But like the traditional mode, as Greg knows, of government is like everything should be tops down, like these massive white papers and all the other stuff. Like I don't think you adopt new technology through white papers. You do it through actual individual user adoption.
And just understanding like the culture even deeper, is your sense that people use ChatGPT for recipes and travel planning already and they're like, oh, great, like now we get to use it in our job and we'll figure out new ways to use it? Or is this, there's a billion users on ChatGPT globally. Is the federal government like the ones that aren't? Are they like, what is ChatGPT? How do I use this? Like, I mean, are there going to need to be training programs on how to do prompts? I mean, like maybe talk through sort of if that's part of the culture shock as well, that people actually don't use LLMs or haven't been using them in their life for the last few years.
I don't know if I can give you a quantitative answer on it. My gut is that there is, the world that we all live in every day is still very different from the world that, a billion people is good, but we know, what is there, 7 billion people in the world or something? So there's still, 80% of the people plus who don't actually use these things. Mm-hmm. So my sense is there's a little bit of that. Training's a real issue. So again, like, I'll give you another great example. So when we first rolled it out, or about to roll it out, our team wanted to literally put a 3-page memo on how you should use it, what the risks are, and we literally were going to have people sign this acknowledgement. And I was like, no, time out. That's the last thing we'll do to ever get people to adopt it. How about tell me the 3 bullets that you care about, right? Don't put PII in this thing if you're worried about it. Don't just take its answer for granted because it might hallucinate. Those are probably good things we should tell people, right? Mm-hmm. But we're going to put a 2 or 3 bullet email out, and no one's signing a document, right? So number one is we have to just again, it goes back to this risk issue. There's not that much risk in people using ChatGPT, quite frankly, in government. 2 is training, right? So the other thing we did is we said, okay, great, here's a bunch of there's a ton of resources. Coursera has a bunch of free resources. OpenAI has a bunch of resources. Yeah. And so we just said, hey, you know what, go schedule it with your manager, but everybody, you're entitled to 2 hours a month of training using all these free resources. You can take time out of work, just clear it with your manager. But we got to give permission for people to actually do this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I don't know the quantitative answer as to whether they're using it in their private lives. My guess is a lot of people are, but I think they've also been told, it's been a slap on the wrist, which is, don't do this in government because this is bad, it's dangerous, it hallucinates, information will leak, all the kind of parade of horrors that, will create a GAO report that nobody wants to respond to, basically.
Totally. Yeah, and one of the frustrations with attracting talent is why I use something all day and I'm dependent on it in my personal life. And now I can't use it at work. Why would I want to come and do things in an antiquated fashion? So that's something we're thinking about also.
Totally.
Yeah, I can tell you the people, the people on my team who, came from Silicon Valley who are working in my department, what they were doing was they would just, on their personal phone, they were using ChatGPT to help them do stuff. Or now at least, hopefully, you could actually use your government laptop to do something that is not nefarious activity.
Totally.
Chair swiveling is the term.
Okay, chair swiveling. Okay, that's good. I hadn't heard that.
That's great. That's
a good one.
So I want to ask one final question, then we'll go into a quick lightning round. But one of the things when we talk to people from our world or from private sector who come into government, I always see they're working 20-hour days. They're just working constantly, right? It is a race against the clock in many cases where there's just an overwhelming amount of work to do. And a lot of people do see it as I have 2, 3, 4 years to make my impact. I'm going to do as much as possible, and hopefully I'll get a little bit done, right? But it's such a big world, it's a big bite to chew, right? Mm-hmm. There's such an overwhelming amount of work to do. When you look ahead a couple years from now, how are you going to measure yourselves in terms of coming from the private sector, having an impact? What are the things where you say, if we get X, Y, and Z done, I will have considered my tour of duty to be extraordinary, and it will have changed the course of my organization? We'll start with you, Scott.
Yeah, I'd say for me, there's really kind of 2 things, and these are my primary goals for our organization is, number one is I want operational efficiency to actually be a real first-class metric in the government, right? So you probably know this, right? But today, everybody's power in government is measured by how big their budget is and how many people they have. And so, again, we get the exact behavior we incent, which is everybody wants to grow their budget and grow their people. What I want people to do is say, you know what, we're stewards of taxpayer dollars. Every single dollar we spend is someone else's money. We have this acronym inside of OPM. We say OPM stands for other people's money. Mm-hmm. And that is and that means that your job is to deliver a high quality service, but your job is always to look at what continuous improvement can I be? And we should reward people actually for doing high quality service at lower costs as opposed to reward people who do the service with, by growing their budget, basically. It's very simple. So number one, I would just that would be number one for me. Number 2 for me just goes directly to the talent conversation we're having, which is if we can get in particular, and again, doesn't need to be exclusive, but if we can get particular early career people, whether it's tech or otherwise, we have this, as I said, we've got a youth problem broadly across government. So, but anybody who wants to be a tech person or a financial analyst or an HR specialist, if we can actually get early career people say, going to government is awesome. It's a great mission. I tackle really hard problems. I learn. I develop my career. And oh, by the way, if I want to then go to the private sector will recognize and reward that service. then I think, like, look, I would be the most optimistic person in the world. Like, we will have, like, the most amazing, like, Pax Americana for the next, 50 years, basically.
Absolutely. And I think it's an amazing opportunity now, too, for young people. I mean, you look at the youth unemployment rates and what's happening, and even in the private sector, where it does seem like it's much harder for college students to find their first job now. If they view it as a 2, 3, 4-year career, and then they can go into the private sector with some skills, that actually feels like a major opportunity to bring young people into government. Would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Absolutely, making work in the government prestigious to the private sector employees and employers. For my technical goals, focusing on the taxpayer and the citizen experience, the web of government websites is insane. That is a passion project of mine.
Yes, we've been talking about this.
Seriously, the concept that you have to tell multiple different government agencies the same thing about you, your birth date, your address, in a bunch of different places. That's crazy. A lot of other countries have solved this in a first-class way. So we're thinking about how we could responsibly implement a consent-based, citizen-centric data sharing between agencies, which would lead to a portal you could go to and see everything in one place: my benefits information, my tax return status, when my passport expires. This is one government. It's all the executive branch. Let's, serve things to the taxpayer in a way that makes sense for them. That's very important to me. And also, just again, going back to this concept of one government, my background in intelligence and my background at Palantir, how do we take a bunch of disparate data sets and use them to drive decision making? Right now, we have a bunch of silos. The president signed an executive order about breaking down these silos. So using data to drive decision turns it into intelligence. So we could really make these intelligence and data driven decisions. That's something I'm focused on.
Okay, well, it would be great to end with a lightning round. A myth about government and tech that you would like to retire, or government tech that you would like to retire. Scott, let's start with you.
Look, I think I think the myth that I'd like to retire is that the government actually cannot and should not be a leading innovator with deployment of technology. I just think it's silly. And again, this whole risk mindset has totally warped everybody's views.
Yeah.
That the tools you'll get are terrible. I have a great laptop. It's fast. The battery works. It lasts a long time. I have an iPhone. So you're not going to be on some antiquated hardware.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about this, but a small process or policy tweak that you think would have the greatest outsized impact?
I think it's very simple, which is just like get people to forget about risk as a pass-fail thing and get people to think about risk as a spectrum of things. And also, as what we talked about, is get people to think about, like, what's the upside benefit of what we're doing. I think if we made that small tweak without going crazy, I think we'd have a lot of difference.
Rethinking the compliance things that came out before computers existed.
One metric you track that you think others should?
I think it's operational efficiency, but...
rework percentage. How often are we doing the things over and over?
A book or a resource you'd recommend to new builders in the public sector?
My favorite is still Only the Paranoid Survive. I think that's still applicable to everybody, whether private or public sector.
The goal in the Phoenix Project, taking manufacturing lessons and applying them to technology.
And then finally, finish the sentence. The U.S. will win the future if we blank.
Win the AI race.
Remain undistracted.
Awesome. Well, Scott, Greg, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about making government cool again and building for the public sector. And we so appreciate the service that you're doing for our country. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Katherine.